So welcome everyone. I am very excited. My name is Andrea Younger and I'm the founder of Creative Branding and your host for this webinar today on how to manage difficult government employees. If you're wondering what creative branding is, we are actually a personal branding agency and we help authors and entrepreneurs and successful business professionals to brand and position themselves as paid experts and authorities in the marketplace. So before we get started, I would like to just give a big shout out to Performance Institute for being our sponsor, and I would like to introduce Mike Lawson, and he's the PI's Director of Education. Mike, welcome.
Thank you, Andrea, and welcome to all of you across the country and quite frankly across the world. Just a bit of background on the Performance Institute. We are delighted to be a partner with Creative Branding and with Stewart Liff in this webinar. The Performance Institute is a nonpartisan private think tank working to improve public as well as private sector performance through principles of transparency, accountability, performance, and engagement. As the nation's leading authority on performance-based management practices for government, PI aims to identify, study, and share leading management innovations pioneered by best-in-class organizations. PI provides research and consulting services, national events, and interactive training programs for both the government and private sector that are designed to overcome operational and managerial challenges that enhance organizational performance. Just a couple examples of kinds of things we do. We host national events, as mentioned. Our Government Performance Summit is actually our 15th Performance Summit, and it will be held here in Washington, D.C., May 4 and 5. We offer a host of courses, and you can consult our website, performanceinstitute.org, for that, including a 2-day course that Stewart is offering on October 20th and 21st here in D.C. We also bring our training to right in-house to provide hands-on direct consultation to government agencies and other organizations. So with that, thank you for your attendance on behalf of all of my colleagues at the Performance Institute. We thank you for participating in this, and I know, having worked with Stewart and having seen him in classes, he is an engaging speaker, and I know you will get much from this webinar. So with that, I will turn it back to Andrea and then on to Stewart.
Thanks, Mike. Hey, just before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items, and I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions because I know this is a popular topic, and I know this is like #1 question that Stu always gets asked. So we definitely want to cover and answer as many questions as possible. So in the little icon box to the left of your name is a little hand. You can click on that to raise your hand during the webinar. At that point, if you raise your hand, it means you want to speak and ask your question. If you are shy and you don't feel like talking today, you can go to your little question box and type your question. We are going to try to answer as many questions as possible, and if we happen to run out of time, Stu has graciously said he will stay on, and we will continue to ask questions even after our time, after 3 p.m. So once again, feel free to ask as many questions. We're going to try to get to them as many as we can. So also, I want to remind you that this session is being recorded and it will be available for replay on PI's website. So let's get started. I'm very excited to introduce Stewart Liff. Just to give you a little trivia facts about Stu and why he is an expert for today's topic is that one, Stu has over 30 years experience as a senior government HR executive. He is the leading author on government management. I think he's up to 6 books now. His latest book is 98 Opportunities to Improve Government Management. And number 3, during his government career, he has taken on some of the toughest challenges in basically transforming government offices. So without further delay, Stu, welcome.
Thanks, Andrea. And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to everybody, depending upon where you are. I know we have people from all over the United States, as well as the UK, Canada, and Australia on, so quite excited to be able to speak to so many folks from so many different parts of the world. We have registrants from counties, cities, states, and the federal government. So it's obviously this is a topic that's, I think, near and dear to many people's hearts, and people I know have struggled with this issue for years. So what we're going to do today is really talk to you about how we can truly deal with difficult government employees. Andrew, if we can go to the next slide. Andrea talked about me, so I'm not going to talk too much more about me, but I've actually written 7 books, 5 of which deal with government, and 2 which can deal with either the public or the private sector. My most recent government book is called 98 Opportunities to Improve Management in Government. But if you see the book on the right, Managing Government Employees, that was my first book about management in government. And that book is probably 9, 10 years old now, and it still continues to do very well. And I think it just illustrates, how much people are looking for knowledge about how to manage their own employees. Again, I've spent, very much like all of you, spent 32 years with the government, sort of halfway in HR, halfway in line management. My last 12 years was a senior executive. So I not only look at situations from a human resources perspective, I look at it from a line management perspective as well. Perhaps the most interesting experience for me was representing the government on 30 third-party hearings. And that's what really influenced much of my thinking for today, because I got to watch cases from the very beginning to the very end. And it made me realize that if you put together the right approach, the right strategy, it's not nearly as difficult as you might think to deal with difficult people. And those strategies and tactics that I've learned, I'm going to be sharing with you today. Finally, I'm very honored to have recently been named a fellow with the Performance Institute. And I'm also a consultant, speaker, and teacher. Now, one thing about me you may not be aware of, which makes me a little bit unique, is I'm also a classically trained fine artist. The painting of the little girl on the right, she's actually the daughter of the little baby on the left, which is my oldest son, Rob. So that background, the bent to the fine arts and being very creative has always had a huge influence on the way I've managed, the way I've operated, and I think even the approach that I've taken towards managing difficult people. So let's go forward now, and I want to share these strategies with you. Let's start off with sort of a challenge. According to McKinsey, a very famous management consulting company, negative interactions with bosses and coworkers have 5 times more impact than positive ones. Think about that for a second. Your problem employees are much more influential than your stars. And that's really what we're all grappling with, is how do we lessen their influence? How do we either turn them into positive people or do other things to deal with them? Now, interestingly, McKinsey also recommends that you deal with your problem employees before undergoing any large-scale transformation effort, because if you don't, they're just going to pull you down. So difficult government employees is something that's recognized, I think, everywhere, both inside and outside government, that they need to be dealt with. But unfortunately, that's been a problem that people have struggled with for decades, if not centuries. Next slide, Andrea. Now, government employees feel the same way. Interesting. They want to be part of a winning organization also. On the 2014 Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, only 28% of the employees surveyed agreed that in their work unit, steps are taken to deal with a poor performer who cannot or will not improve. And that trend has been going down steadily. It started in 2011 at 31%, went down to 30 to 29, now down to 28%. So basically, more than 7 out of 10 government employees don't believe that management is doing the right thing and dealing with poor performers. So that sort of, to me, sets the tone for what we're dealing with. Now, to put this in context, to me, the goal is not solely to deal with difficult government employees. It's to build an engaged, committed, and high-performing workforce. And to do that, you can't simply let the difficult people sit idly by, because virtually all organizations are in what I call the battle for the hearts and minds of the middle 80%. Now, who's in the battle? It's the top 10% and the bottom 10% are fighting for the hearts and minds of the middle 80%. Now, from the perspective of the top 10%, they simply want everybody to step up. Come on, we can do it. We can do great things. I want us to be part of a winning organization. Conversely, the bottom 10%, they have a completely different perspective. Their point of view is, slow down. You're working too hard. You're making me look bad. I got 12 years to go till I retire. What are you killing yourself? Your next administration is going to change and bring in a whole new set of ideas, so slow down. So whoever wins this battle is going to dictate to a large extent what goes well in the organization and what does not. If the bottom 10% wins, well, the top 10%, who are your most marketable employees, they're going to slowly conclude that this is not an organization that values performance, and they're going to leave. And now your organization is going to take a negative turn to the left because your top 10% of your employees will be gone. And that's something you want to avoid at all costs. Conversely, if you deal with just a couple of people from the bottom and action is taken against them, the other people in the bottom 10% are going to say, whoa, if they can deal with him, they'll probably be coming after me next. And all of a sudden, you're going to see the organization starting to take a positive turn to the right. So whoever wins that battle, it's going to make a huge difference in the future and the health of the organization. One quick story. When I took over my first assignment as a senior executive in the government, I ran an office that had not fired anybody in years. My predecessor had believed that firing a government employee was tantamount to capital punishment, and he didn't believe in capital punishment. As a result, no one had been fired. Well, when I got there, it was very clear who the worst employee was, and in a few months, we fired this employee. And I walked around thinking, what's going to be the reaction of the employees, having not seen any of their peers fired, in many cases for a decade or more. Well, when I walked around, the reaction of the employees was simply this: what took you bozos so long? It's about time you dealt with a problem employee. And that's one of the key points to all of this, that government employees want to be part of a winning organization. They want their managers to deal with their problem employees. They want them to do that. So that then, of course, raises the question, why do managers struggle so much in government to deal with difficult employees? And the best way to answer that would be to give you an illustration of something that happens every day. Andrea, let's go back to the previous slide. Typically, let's just take an illustration. John Doe comes in late 3 or 4 times. His supervisor decides to orally counsel John. John then files a grievance. He feels he's being harassed. He comes in late again. The supervisor gives him this time gives him a written counseling. Now John files a second grievance and says that the written counseling is in retaliation for the first grievance. He comes in late again. The supervisor this time gives him an admonishment. Now John files an EEO complaint, says you're discriminating against me because of my race. He comes in again late. He gets a reprimand. Now he files a second EEO complaint saying it's retaliation. Here he's been late 4 times. The supervisor has 2 grievances, 2 EEO complaints, and a boss saying, what's going on over there? And by the way, the supervisor still has to manage the workload. John comes in late a 5th time. This time he gets a short suspension. Now the supervisor, again, issued this short suspension. John then says, well, wait a second, by the way, not only am I filing another complaint, I'm also a union official. I'm going to be out on official time 8 hours a week. It comes in late again. This time they give him a long suspension. Now he files an unfair labor practice saying you're filing a complaint against me because I'm a union official. I hope this all sounds familiar to you. Or actually, I hope it doesn't, but unfortunately I suspect it does. And by the way, he suddenly has a fall on the job and now is out for 45 days. At the end of the 45 days, he comes back to work and says, well, I need to be retrained. He's retrained for 30 days. He comes in late again. Management, he then proposes removal. It goes to the director who says, look at all these complaints and grievances we have. Let's settle them by moving them somewhere else. And this happens all the time in government. And when that happens, people learn the lesson, managers learn the lesson. It's not worth putting the time and energy into this because I'm not going to be supported. I'm not going to be sustained. It takes so much energy. It diverts me from getting the job done that it's incredibly frustrating. And these lessons have been passed on from generation to generation. And ultimately, I think that's why no action is taken. Now, the lesson I want you to take away from today as I go forward is that people are taking the wrong lessons, that you can deal with difficult government employees. You can. All you need is the will and the skill. What I'm going to try and do is have you unlearn some of the lessons you've all probably learned about how to move forward and share my experiences that I have learned and help you move forward, because I've successfully dealt with government employees throughout my career and helped other organizations thereafter, because it can be done. All you need is the will and the skill. Okay, Andrea. Now, before I actually go into how you do that, I just want to talk briefly about warning signs of difficult employees. I've identified 5 here. They're not all inclusive, but I think when you're looking around and wanting to figure out where some of your problems are, these are some good indicators. The first one is the fact that all the employees know who the poor employees are. They all know. Anytime I walk into an organization, within a couple of hours, I know who the problem employees are because everybody tells you who they are. They're the ones who tend to be the cynics, who see the worst in others. They're the ones who are always criticizing management. No matter what management does, they're never happy. And yet they're also the ones who rarely take responsibility for their actions. If they're late, it's because the car broke down, traffic was bad. To quote Michael Corleone, thank you. Okay, so hopefully you heard me end with the last slide. Now, in terms of managing difficult employees, as I see it, there are 4 keys. And they are your management team and your advisors, your approach, that is the tactics, strategies, philosophies that you apply in dealing with difficult people, your attitude and fear, and lessons learned. I want to walk you through each one. So, Andrea, let's go on to the next one.
Okay. 1 second. There.
Okay, your management team is crucial. In order to have a successful HR program where you deal with difficult people, everyone must be on the same page. Who do I mean by everyone? The first line and the second line supervisors, and the person who's making the final decision. We must all have a philosophy that we are going to successfully deal with our poor performers, our problem employees. That doesn't mean we're going to fire everybody, but it means we're going to have a program of accountability and apply it to everyone fairly, honestly, and appropriately. The attorneys, in many organizations these days use attorneys, must be on the same page as well. But in my view, perhaps the most important player is your HM advisor. In my experience, there are 2 different types of HR advisors. There's one who says, if the manual doesn't say you can do it, you can't do it. The other is, if the manual doesn't say you can't do it, you can do it. I'm a strong believer that you need an advisor who is creative, is willing to help you get where you need to go, as long as it's legal, appropriate, and I'll say morally correct as well. So having a great HR advisor is crucial. But part of the problem dates back to reinventing government. Reinventing government did many, many great things in the 90s under the Clinton administration. But one thing that did happen, which I think really set the government back, was centralizing human resources. By centralizing human resources, we wound up with an outflow of people from that field, resulting in nowhere near the degree of expertise in HR that we saw in the past. As a result, we've had many attorneys now have stepped in and taken over the HR role. And I think that's caused some problems. And why is that? Well, because attorneys, their job, they're trained to win cases, and they do a very good job at that. But that's not the same thing as giving HR advice. HR's role is to help the supervisors manage their organization. That's not the same thing necessarily as winning cases. Their job is to help them process claims, defend our country, clean the environment, take care of America's veterans, what have you. And therefore, the advice should not necessarily always be about winning and losing. It should be about how do we successfully manage the organization, which is a different skill set. So it's something that I want you to keep in mind, that it expanded to where it was in the past, because at the early stages of any action, having an trusted HR advisor there helping a government supervisor walk them through the process, helping them get off to a good start and craft a strategy for dealing with a difficult employee is absolutely crucial. Okay, Andrea. So let's now get into the actual how. First of all, when you're dealing with problem employees, identify them. As I said earlier, everyone knows who they are, and craft a strategy for each one. I remember working in New York years ago with a new division chief who came to me and said, "Stu, I can't manage my division. I have a number of problem employees." So I said, "Okay, come back to me and give me the names, and we'll figure out how we deal with each person." I figured he'd come back with 4 or 5. He came back with 29 names. We sat down with every single and talked about each person, and some people, it's simply a matter of telling them, you're doing certain things that are not acceptable, and they turned around because they never knew that. But others, we had to craft a strategy, and that ranged from putting them on a leave restriction letter to taking disciplinary action for misbehavior, et cetera, et cetera. The point is, at the end of 2 years, 23 of them were gone, and the other 6 turned around and became acceptable employees. So my point is, you can successfully deal with your problem employees if you have a strategy. Next point, and this is one I see all the time, don't give up before you start. So many people feel it's so difficult to manage difficult employees that they just give up. They figure, we can't do this, let's not waste our time. Next point, deal with them. Sadly, whenever I give a class like this, and I ask the group, how does the government deal with problem employees? The invariable answer is, we move them. What I'd like you to think about, take away from today, is when we have a problem employee, from now on we're going to deal with them. We're not going to simply move them around, we're going to deal with them. Because if you begin to build that mindset into your culture, that will begin to shift the way you approach it. Keep it simple, stupid. So often, supervisors in particular get so caught up in all the employees' problems, complaints, issues, et cetera, that they lose sight of the fact that the real issue is not the employee's problem, the issue is the employee's behavior and or performance. So, for example, one illustration, when we have someone who's on who's on leave without pay, they've used up all their family-friendly Leave Act hours, and they come in with a doctor's note that simply says employee needs to be out for 3 more months. When I asked a class to supervise, what would you do in that situation? Their answer is, invariably, I would ask for more information. And to me, that loses sight of the point. The issue is not whether the employee is sick or how much more information you need, because you can always get more information from a doctor. The issue is, do we need the employee to come in or not? And in this situation, we did. And since leave without pay is purely discretionary, the solution was to simply say no. And there's hundreds of MSPB decisions that will support that approach. So again, keep it simple. Focus on the employee's performance and or behavior. Don't focus primarily on their excuses, their issues, their complaints. Then the next thing is use the probationary period. That's one of the best tools you have. It's considered the last part of the recruitment of the selection process, and use it. Throughout my career, every time we brought on a class of people, we always terminated at least one person during probation. And again, for the same reasons I mentioned earlier. Very quickly during probation, the ones who are not going to make it, everybody knows it. If you make a good faith effort to try and turn them around and they don't do it, Better to cut them loose then than to have them pass probation and have the regular civil service protections. Okay, Andrea. Another approach is tennis. Analogy I like is tennis. If you've ever played tennis, you always want to serve rather than receive. Why? Because the server has the initiative. What I want you as supervisors or HR experts to consider is, how do I put myself in a position where I'm serving rather than receiving? Because to go back to the last bullet, the objective is to be on offense, not defense, and that's what we're going to talk about next. Now, the middle bullet about if they never cross the line, change the line, is something I would see constantly in my career as an HR person. A supervisor would come up to me and said, you know, he just came all the way up to the line, but he never crossed the line. Well, what that really means is that you allow the employee to keep pushing the line further and further to the right, that you forgot where the line should have been years ago. You need to reset that line to where it needs to be. And then if someone crosses the line, you take appropriate action. And we're going to talk about how to take appropriate action momentarily. So this whole mindset is about, instead of you being the one who's on the defensive, and because the employee pushing you around through various complaints, grievances, union actions, etc., you're going to take charge of the situation because you are a member of management, and that's the way the system was intended to work. Okay, Andrea. So, how do you deal with a difficult employee? This is kind of just a process that I would recommend everybody follow. You let the employee know what's expected of him. Whether if it's performance-wise, that's their performance standards. If it's conduct-wise, you periodically have a team meeting and you say, this is what I expect. I expect people to come in on time, blah, blah, you follow my orders, blah, blah, be a team player, etc., etc. Where there's a problem, whether it's behavior and or performance, let the employee know. You see there's an asterisk there because that's where people fall back the most. Far too often the supervisor never puts the employee on notice that there's a problem. Now I recognize that human beings, by and large, don't like confrontation. So that's why I think, for the most part, people do not raise the issue. They try and avoid it. But the more you avoid it, the more the situation is metastasizing. After you bring the problem to the employee's attention, listen to his or her perspective. They may have a perspective you're not aware of. That's valuable information you want to know up front. Assuming you still conclude that there's a problem, tell the employee what he or she needs to do to improve. That's only fair. The employee should know what they need to do. It's very clear. Very important, advise the employee of the consequences if she doesn't improve. If the employee knows what they need to do and then knows what's going to happen if they don't, it's very, very clear. A lot of the problems with this is people are unclear. Where possible, help the employee improve, especially on a performance issue that you're required to help the employee try and improve. On many conduct issues, it might be simply a matter of telling the employee what they're doing, the employee may not be realizing it. But then, and this is a key component of today, if the employee does not approve, take the appropriate action. And that's where I come to what I call the principle of reliable consequences. In any organization, for you to succeed, there must be reliable consequences for every level of performance and behavior, whether we like you or not. That means that an outstanding employee, the reliable consequence is that you should get a bonus. You're more likely to get promoted, et cetera, et cetera. If you're a fully successful employee and your behavior is fully successful, then the consequences are you retain your job, you'll get your normal within grade increases, et cetera, et cetera. But if you're a poor employee, then the consequences need to be that we're going to take appropriate action to help you improve, and if not, we will eventually change you one way or the other. And if you apply that across the organization, regardless of whether we like an employee or not, because this is where we have to separate relationships from systems, if people begin to see that there are reliable consequences for everybody in the organization that will be applied consistently, then you will start having the system drive the right performance and drive the right behavior. And what that's going to do is free up the supervisor, because he or she is going to have to spend less time, because people will automatically see that there are consequences, and they will try and give you what you want, rather than simply sort of doing whatever they want to do because they don't believe there's any consequences for misbehavior or poor performance. Okay, Andrea? So this is one of the most important slides. When you're terminating someone for conduct, if you're going to take an action, take a strong one. Now, what I mean by this is, if you go back to the analogy the example I gave you before about going oral counseling, written counseling, admonishment, reprimand, suspension, long suspension. If you string this out long enough, you're going to be, more times than not, you're going to be buried in grievances and paperwork that's going to just be a complete administrative nightmare. Now, let me be clear, though, before I go forward. This approach I'm recommending primarily when you're dealing with someone from the bottom 10%. Because the bottom 10% are the ones who you'd most likely look to terminate for conduct or poor performance. If, on the other hand, you have someone who's been a good employee but maybe going through health issues, maybe going through a divorce, a parent may be sick, and you recognize this is not someone from the bottom 10%, you don't need to take as strong an action. Because when we go back to the principle of progressive discipline, which I'll talk about in a minute, you only take an action, strong action you need to change the person's behavior. So a second principle behind this is, when you have a problem, the sooner you bring a problem to a head, the sooner the problem is going to go away. That's one of the big mistakes we make. We go so slowly, move so slowly, out of fear of something that may happen 2 years down the road, that we wind up almost giving up before we start. So remember, the sooner you have a problem and you bring it to a head, the sooner the problem is going to go away. Let me give you an illustration. I was hired when I was interviewed for my first job as a personnel officer. At my interview, all the director and assistant director wanted to talk about was an employee in finance who was a 6th degree black belt in karate and had been intimidating everybody in that division for years. And they were scared to death of this person. They didn't know what to do. So they asked me if I could handle it, and I said I could handle it. They hired me as the personnel officer. My second day on the job, his division chief came up to me and said, "Here he goes again." He came right up close to the line, but didn't cross the line. I said, "Well, explain to me what he did." He explained to me what he did, and in fact what he had been was he had threatened him. But the division chief had become so blind that he didn't even realize that anymore. And so I said, "Okay, I want you to do things my way for a change. I want you to propose his removal, and I want you to put him on administrative leave pending a decision." And he said, "What? We can't do that." And I said, "Why not?" He said, "That's the way we've always been told we can't do that." And my response was, "If you do things the way you've always done them, you'll get the same results you've always gotten. Try it my way." He tried it my way and gave the proposed removal to this big, tough 6th degree black belt. And you know what happened? He started crying. He said, "I can't afford to lose my job." Of course, our reaction was, "We should have thought about that years ago." And he said, "Besides which, I have a psychiatric problem." So we said, "Well, bring in your note, but we still plan to go forward." He brought in a note saying that he was 100% service connected from the VA for psychosis. And we then said, "Well, we're still going to go forward. You could present that as part of your defense, but, did you ever consider disability retirement?" And he said, "I never really wanted to work here anyway." He applied for disability retirement. 6 weeks later, OPM approved it, and he was gone. So he was there. He was on board exactly a day and a half when I was there, and we never saw him again. And that was what happened because we brought a problem to a head. When employees understand or believe that their job is on the line, that's when the situation starts to get serious. As long as they don't think their job is on the line, they're not going to treat you seriously. So when you bring a problem to a head, now you're serving, you're no longer receiving. And so this concept of progressive discipline, people always think you must take the least action possible. Well, that's true, but you need to take the least action possible to change the behavior of an employee. If someone's in the bottom 10%, you're really thinking weak action is going to do anything, they're going to scoff at you. So that's my point. Most organizations that have table of disciplines generally give a wide range. And my point here is take a stronger action against someone in the bottom 10%. Because the sooner you bring it to a head, the sooner the problem is going to be solved one way or the other. And remember, most people can't afford to be removed from the government. Nobody wants a removal from the government on their permanent record, and someone who's made a commitment to the government doesn't want to lose those benefits. So remember that you have all the lawyers in the world behind you. We have the weight of the government behind us, and where difficult employers often use the protections as they're entitled to use them to benefit them, you should use the resources behind you in the government to level the playing field, so to speak. Okay, Andrea. Now, in terms of performance, that's a different situation. There's basically two different approaches you can take. One is called a performance-based action under Chapter 432 of the U.S. Code. The other is what's called a conduct-based action under Part 752. In both situations, you use you potentially remove the person for poor performance, but the approaches are very different. Under Part 432, that's where you give the employee a performance improvement plan. If the employee fails, you only have to prove your case by substantial evidence, which simply means you have to prove your case in a way that a reasonable person would conclude that your evidence, that your case was reasonable. If you then go to a third party, MSPB or an arbitrator, they can't mitigate. So they either find for you or against you, but they can't say instead of removing the employee, we're going to demote them. The advantage of going under conduct-based is you don't have to, or Part 752, you don't have to issue the performance improvement plan. You must prove your case by a preponderance of evidence, which is 51% or greater. In this situation, a third party can mitigate. Now, many people recommend going the conduct-based route because it can be faster, which is true. But I actually recommend you going the first route in most situations, because if you have a performance system set up and in place, you want the system to operate as intended. If people see that you apply the system consistently, there's reliable consequences, over time, the system is going to drive the right behavior. People say, uh-oh, if I don't do 4.5 widgets a day, action is going to be taken. I'll make sure I do 4.5. If I can get up to 6 and that gives me a bonus, I'm going to strive to get to 6. So I think in most cases, you want to go the performance-based route, and everybody knows that you have a system that's meaningful. There are reliable consequences. And I think if you did it over time, people will really begin to follow the system because they see it's going to be applied properly and it's going to make a difference. The other advantage of that, of course, is there's a lower standard of proof and the action can't be mitigated. Now, if you have a mixed case, then a conduct-based action, a mixed case is when it's both conduct and performance-based, that might make more sense in that situation, or when you really need to get someone out the door quickly, that's another reason for doing that. But for most situations, I strongly recommend that you go the performance-based action route. But if you have a person who's a performance problem, don't wait and wait and wait and hope that the problem is going to go away. Deal with it quickly and bring it to a head quickly. Next slide, please. Now, the next piece of it is your mindset. Either you believe you can or you can't remove a federal employee. It's up to you. And what I learned, again, early in my career is you can remove a federal employee. It's really, all you need, as I said before, is the will or the skill. What people don't realize is that relatively few removals actually wind up before third parties in government. There's this belief that it's so hard to fire someone, and then when you do that, you're going to get reversed all the time. That's not the reality. So I want to give you a few statistics, and if you want more detail about them, you can find them in my book called The Complete Guide to Hiring and Firing a Government Employee. But as of that writing, which was I think about 2011, 2012 time period, for every 100 employees that were removed in the federal government, only about 20%, only 20 of them would appeal. You might say, how could that be? How could only 20 out of every 100 appeal? The reason for that is because most people who get fired don't want a removal on their record, so they'll retire, they'll settle and resign, or they won't even bother to file the federal government. So only 20 out of 100 even choose to go to a third party. Once you go to a third party, whether it's MSPB, Merit Systems Protective Board for the federal government, or an arbitrator, they always push you to try and settle the case. And 40% of the time, those cases settle. So now you're down to only 12 out of 100 people going to a third party. And generally before the U.S. Merit Systems Protection Board, the government prevails about 80, maybe 85% of the time, depending upon the year. Arbitrators more like 67, about two-thirds of the time. But my point being is that for every 100 government employees who get fired, on average, maybe 2 to 4% of them get their jobs back. And when if you have a weak case, there are plenty of chances to settle along the way. The difference being, if you take this approach, you're operating from a position of strength, not from a position of weakness. Next. And if you go to a third party, and again, that's a relatively small percentage, that's where you want to have an expert, either an attorney or a strong HR person represent you. You want to make sure you have good documentation. One of the key components when an agency loses is because they don't prepare their witnesses. Especially the supervisors must be prepared, because I can't tell you, how often I've seen cases where a supervisor came in and wasn't even conversant with the union contract or with the agency's policy on discipline. So make sure you prepare the witnesses. And then whoever paints the better picture is going to win. So that's what you want to do, is why you want the good HR person at the beginning, helping you paint the picture at the very beginning, explaining why you're taking the action you took, explaining, showing the documentation that explains the actions, why you took the action. And if you do that, and you have a nexus between the action taken and the employee, and how it improves the service of the government, you're going to prevail. Next. So here's the lessons learned. Document, document, document. Better documentation you have, the better off you're going to be. Now, by the way, a lot of times you're going to find that people haven't kept documentation. Well, when you are as an HR official brought into the case, if you don't have documentation at the time, there's nothing to prevent you from creating the documentation. What I don't mean is making something up, but there's nothing to stop you from going out to witnesses and asking them to put a document, putting a memo for the record together at that time, simply saying on or about such and such happened and dating it at the time they write the document. Also, you don't need a perfect case to win. This is not a court of law. You don't have to win your case by beyond a reasonable doubt. It's only going to be by preponderance of the evidence. Avoid third parties if you can, but don't fear them. Better to occasionally lose a case than to never take an action. I've removed people, and on one case they got their job back. We removed them 6 months later. It stood. And then finally, and this is a critical point, better to let your bottom 10% of the people fight you from the outside. These are the ones who are going to be standing there at the photocopy machine copying every single piece of paper that involves them even remotely. They're going to, I guarantee you, they're going to have a diary writing down everything you said as a supervisor, everything you did. They're going to be gathering other people in support of their case. They're going to be polluting the environment. Let them fight you from the outside. You'll be in the position of strength, and your organization is going to be better for it. So, Andrea, next slide. I think it's probably time. I've gone about 45 minutes. I'll be happy to answer any questions that anybody has at this time.
Hey, Stu. Thanks, everyone. Great presentation. Sorry for the little glitch I lost my connectivity there for a second. But we do have some questions for you. And let me get to those questions. And the first one is from Christine. And she says, often disciplinary actions do occur, but this is not information that managers can discuss with employees. This leads to employees feeling no action ever takes place. Can this be part of why there is a conception that disciplinary actions never occur?
That's possible. That's certainly possible. I think it depends upon how strong the action you take, because my experience is when you bring the action to a head, that suddenly creates a different degree of emotion and fear in the minds of the poor employee. At that point, that's where they're going to start talking to their coworkers and saying, do you believe what management did to me? When it's a lower level action, typically they don't want to disclose it. They want to keep it, they want to play it close to the vest. But if you're taking a strong action, that's something different. And when someone watches an employee go out the door, that sends a very, very powerful message. Clearly there are privacy issues, but my experience is once you're taking a strong action, like I've advocated, then the union typically gets involved, the employee is much less likely to keep it close to the vest, and word will spread.
And also Christine added that she said, I issued one day suspension this morning, but the other employees will not be informed of this action.
1 day suspension, probably not, because a 1 day suspension is not going to bring the case to a head.
Mm-hmm.
Because a 1 day suspension, you're still pretty far away from taking a disciplinary action. On the other hand, once you've issued the 1 day suspension, the next time the person screws up, then you can take a much stronger action. And eventually the word will get out. That's the whole point. There has to be, when people begin to see consequences, when they begin to see that management's acting strongly, the word will begin to spread because people will start talking. And you don't have to fire a lot of people for it to really sink in. All you need to do is fire one or two when everybody starts to get the message. And people do talk to each other, but it's when you're acting from a position of strength is when the word has a tendency to spread, to spill over into the workforce much more quickly.
So Susan asks, in the incidents with the unpaid leave extension, how do you deal with the possible ADA requirement of extended leave as an accommodation?
Well, I think the first thing you have to do is find out all the details. The key on ADA is whether the person can or can't do the job. And if they're on extended leave, you have to ask yourself whether the person can do the job. So that would be one of the first questions I would be asking. I think people often operate from positions of fear on ADA when I think you have to really look at it from a business case. Can you explain to a third party why you were not able to grant it? You could also look at that from several other ways. For example, can the person work from home? Would you simply do what you want to avoid doing is simply taking what the person gives you and assuming that's fact, because there's generally much more flexibility in dealing with these types of situations than might appear at first blush.
So McDelia asks, what happens when a manager in the group won't do the work and it is affecting all the other managers?
I think if the manager's boss, are you talking about the manager? Is that manager above the other managers?
I'm not quite sure what she references. She just says affecting all other.
I would say when that situation has occurred, I'm going to assume.
Oh, she says no coworker.
Coworker. In that situation, then what I would recommend is that several of the managers get together, document how that's had an adverse effect, and go to senior management. They can either first go to the employee as a peer, and try and help that peer turn around, which would probably be the ideal scenario, and give him a chance to turn around. But advise him that these are the consequences for not improving. We then plan to go to upper management with documentation, and ask them to intercede.
So Tony asks, advise EE of consequences is often viewed by the union as threats. I am told that rather than giving warning to just take the action.
I think it depends upon the circumstance. If someone has committed a very severe action, you take the action. If it's something that's relatively harmless, for example, several times of being late 15 minutes, I think it would be appropriate to give the person, put them on notice. If you're dealing in a situation where the union's going to fight you, they're going to fight you one way or the other. But if you at least, what you always want to do is appear to be reasonable, and depending upon the degree of the conduct, to me would dictate whether we first give the person a warning or not.
Actually, Rudy Cortez raised his hand. So, Rudy, you want to ask your question?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I can, Rudy.
Oh, just what book do you recommend for sort of the nuts and bolts of removing somebody, rather than a book just to motivate employees? I know there's so many of them, but which one would you recommend?
If you're looking for nuts and bolts, it would be the book "How to Complete Guide to Hiring and Firing a Government Employee." In that book, I lay out the process. I actually give you sample letters of counseling, sample reprimands, sample proposed removals, sample memos for the record. Talk about all the steps to do that and how to win before a third party. So I think for that particular question, that would be the one I'd recommend.
The Complete Guide
to Hiring and Firing a Government Employee.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next question comes from Dave from Baltimore. In your experience, did unions buy into the different approach you favored, or did they fight back? Should you let them know what you were going? Should you let them know that you were going to be taking a new approach, or does that just create problems from the beginning?
I think it depends upon the union you're dealing with and the circumstances. But let me answer that in two different ways. In one way, I decided to post. I was in a situation where the performance was so desperate within a unit, that I decided to post each individual employee's performance. You would think that in that situation the union would be furious. How could you do this? You'd think they'd want me to tear it down, so to speak. As a matter of fact, they were supportive of this approach because, in my experience, the unions, the biggest complaint is disparate treatment. And what I said in this situation, what we're going to do is we're going to post everybody's performance, not by name, but by letter, symbol. And then everybody's going to know how they're doing relative to everybody else. Management is going to be forced to treat everybody the same and can no longer be able to protect their favorites. So when taking such an approach, the key what the union is looking for, I think, is less how hard or how soft you're going, but how consistently are you applying it. And unions ultimately are looking to manage. They want their organization to survive, and if the organization is not doing very well, their headquarters will slowly chip away at their FTE and their resources. So I think what you'd have to do is bring them into the fray and say, I'm trying to. These are the problems we've had in the past. This is what I plan to do in the future. I'm gonna put more of a focus on accountability. But what I can assure you is I'm going to treat everybody consistently, and there's no longer going to be management going after people they don't like and management protecting their favorites. We're going to treat everybody consistently and in accordance with our table of penalties. And I think if you bring them in with that message at the beginning, that's a hard message to argue because that's always been the biggest complaint of the union, that management does not treat their people fairly and equitably.
So the next question comes from Karen, and she asks, what does one do when all levels of management are in alignment?
Is that are in alignment or are not in alignment?
Aren't in alignment.
Well, I think that's where you have to, at some point, find out where is the alignment lacking? Is it lacking? It's one thing if it's lacking at the director's level. It's another thing if it's lacking at the HR level. If it's at the HR level, I would go to the HR. I would go with some other similarly, other managers who see things the same way, and go to the HR manager and simply say, "This is a problem, and this is what we need from you. You're killing us. You're out of line with everybody else." And if that doesn't work, I would escalate it, but I would first give the HR the chance to do that. If it's at the director level, that's obviously a bigger problem. But in that situation, again, I would try and get a groundswell of support to go up to the director and explain and have documentation saying this is what's been happening and why this is how people feel. And because I think most managers in government want to succeed, and if you can make a good case as to why there are gaps which is hurting the organization, then not always, but in many cases, people start to see why. Another approach, quite frankly, that sometimes works is giving them a book, just saying, take a look at this, because when you give someone a book, and they read the book. They have the time to read it, not under the same stress when you're coming into a half-hour conversation. And they start to read the stories, and they start to relate to it, and they say, now I get what you're talking about. So those are some strategies that I've adopted over time and to get people to move along that path.
So a question from Kevin asked, do you train arbitrators or have they reached out to you based on your expertise?
Do I train arbitrators?
Yes.
No. The way arbitrators are independent bodies that go through the Federal Services Impaneled panel, and they go on a list from which management of the union makes selections. And the arbitrators are independent third parties who decide grievances usually. So my only role with arbitrators has been to represent the government before arbitrators, but I have no role in terms of training them unless one or more of them have read one of my books.
Okay. So the next question comes from Marguerite. Do you have an advice with managing employees where there is suspected misuse of FMLA?
I think it's simply you have to identify what is the problem, what do you suspect, and then you have to look at the pattern and try and figure out what's going on. You could ask for more documentation. You might even it's kind of situational. I've even on occasion could potentially bring the IG in to look into it if I felt it was serious enough. It really just depends on what's the problem and where we want to go about. Looking into it. So it's really situational. I'd be happy if the person asking the call would want to talk to me offline to try and go into more details. Sure. So it's hard to answer that question, in front of a lot of folks without having a lot of details.
So we're coming up on 3 o'clock, and I still have lots of questions for you, Stu. So what we're going to do is, I know it's 3 o'clock, at least here in New York, wherever you are in the other parts of the world. But I know some people may have to rush off, do meetings and all that stuff. So why don't we sort of close out, like say our final thank you, goodbye to those people, and then those people who want to stay on, we're help and still have questions. We can stay on for at least another 15 minutes, and Stu's available to answer questions if that sounds good.
Andrea?
Yeah.
Andrea, before we finish, we might want to go to one more slide.
Okay. There we go.
And this is just contact information. A couple of things I wanted to mention. First, I want to thank those who are leaving or will be leaving for joining us. Here's the contact information for the Performance Institute, and here's my contact information as well. Michael, I think, made a mistake when he mentioned that my class on managing individual organizational performance is going to be October in Washington, D.C. In fact, it's in April. 20th to 21st, that PI training class, and either myself or PI will certainly be here to help you in terms of if you like customized additional training, consulting, or what have you. I just wanted to leave that open to anybody who's leaving right now.
And Mike, I just want to turn it over to you because I would just want to say a big thanks for PI sponsoring this webinar. And so if you want to have a few thoughts before everyone takes off.
Yeah, thank you very much. First of all, thanks to Stu for conducting this webinar. I hope you really do avail yourself of asking Stu a few questions. Those of you in the D.C. area, or even those of you that can fly in for his course in April 20th and 21st. Hopefully some of you can attend the Government Performance Summit that's scheduled here in D.C. on May 4 and 5. Please consult our calendar, and consult our course catalog for 2015. That gives you a calendar of when we offer courses and the detailed outline of those courses. Please let us know if one of the talented members of the PI team can help you or your organization, whether it's a call, whether it's an in-house consultation, whether it is bringing our training in-house to your organization. Please, we are available for all of that assistance to make government work better. So again, thank you on behalf of the Performance Institute, and I'll turn it now back to Andrea and Stu.
Thanks, Mike. So if you have to leave, I just want to say thank you so much for joining the Creative Expert webinar. And we hope that you have enjoyed this and you found this helpful. And for those leaving us, have a great day. And by all means, Stu has his information up here on the website, or if you want to, or you can also contact me. You have my email address. Send me a note. Happy to connect you to Mike or to Stu or whoever you need to be connected to. Happy to make those introductions. So anyway, Stu, let's continue on with the questions we have going.
Cool.
And the next one is from Erwin, and he said, what if legal says court cases and generous juries mean we will lose our cases even if we are in the right?
Well, I don't want to I don't want to tell the legal side I don't want to do their job for them. But I think if you look at the statistics, very few cases. Again, if you look at the statistics I've just cited, and management only loses 2 to 4% of them, how many cases really ever go to court? Very, very few. And if and if you operate from that mindset, you'll never do anything. So if it looks like the case, several years down the road is going to go to court, then you'll always have a chance to settle. But I wouldn't start with that premise that every case you go forward you're going to lose. It's just, first of all, most cases never go to MSPB, and of those that go to MSPB, only a few that's much smaller are going to court because it's very, very expensive to go to court. So to me, that's unfortunately an example of where we give up before we start, and where I would not take that mindset. And I think that's where I would push back. And the other question is who's running the organization? Is it the legal side or is it the management side?
Okay. So this next person asks, it's Deborah. She says, how do you handle an employee that has communication issues? I have an employee that no one wants to work with. She can't read nonverbal signals that she has pushed her point of views too far. When I send her to work in support of programs, they soon send her back but refuse to document any issues.
Well, I don't know why they refuse to document the issues, but I think the first thing I would do is to try and determine is that a medical problem, and I'd probably have a medical evaluation to see if that is a medical problem. Sometimes sometimes the communication could be something with someone's brain. So that would be the first thing I would try and identify, because if you're not dealing with a medical issue, then you simply want to focus on the behavior. And I would and someone refusing. That's something that's unacceptable. If someone refuses to do documentation, that's insubordination as well. I hate to say it, and it's not something I've often done, but there have been occasions where people have refused to do something like that, and I've said, you're now insubordinate. And the point there is that people who work for the government are part of a team, and if management asks them to do something, then we expect them to do something. It's maybe a little bit of a harder line that you've typically heard, but that's what, think of it this way. If this were your own business and your family's livelihood depended on it, how would you want and expect your employees to operate? That would be my expectation.
Just following up on this question, Paula asks, are we allowed to overrule a doctor's order?
I think the doctor does not manage the employee. The supervisor does. Okay. So the first question would be, what does the doctor's order say? Doctor's order allegedly say. Then the question is, what are we dealing with? I would not. If a doctor said the employee can't do this, this, and this, I don't think I would accept that and say that's the end of it. I go back to the doctor and say, what can the employee do and what can't the employee do? And then I would work around that. You don't let the doctor run your organization. You have to take control of that situation. So that's what I would be doing.
So David had another question. He had asked a question earlier, and he said, what can you do to make sure dealing with the bottom 10% does not bring up questions of race, gender, or other discrimination?
I think that's where you have to have that's where your documentation is very important. And it's a great question, because when you run an organization, you want to be aware of all your statistical issues. You want to make sure, am I disciplining people? What percentage of minorities are being disciplined? What percentage of minorities women, what have you, are in supervisory positions. You want to be aware of all those statistics. That's something you need to be sensitive to, because that's something that's often the case. But then, I think the real question is going to be, you may initially, if the bottom 10% of the workforce falls into a certain category, then the real question, you initially, the statistics may not help you. But then the real question though is, if someone, let's say, who is white and did the same thing, did you take the same action against him? So that's where you want to be aware of the statistics, both in terms of what percentage of action is being taken against a certain class or group, but secondly, are you treating one group differently than the other? If you have 4 people at the bottom 10%, all are AWOL, and you removed all 4 of them, and you have someone who's in the top 70% who's also AWOL for roughly the same period of time, that's what's ultimately going to have you lose a case. There's just statistics alone create a prima facie case, or presumably true case, but that is not enough for you to lose a case, because then the burden shifts to you as management to demonstrate why you took the action you took. And if I can show that, in my organization, there were 4 people, 5 people with this, and each person, regardless of race, color, creed, sex, etc., were treated the same way, ultimately you'll prevail the vast majority of times under those situations.
So one of the questions came up, and I think this is really, I think a lot of people sometimes it's from Jennifer, and she said, we have an individual who we feel have health issues, paranoid tendencies, for example, but he is not interacting with the branch or partners as needed. Many of the issues are difficult to document. He said, you said, also have management team member that does not want to take action for fear of pushing this individual over the edge. Seems like conduct based, but there maybe our best action, if we want action sooner rather than later, has been fully rated, fully successful, but performance plans not written very well. Thoughts?
Yeah, well, again, that's one where I'd have to have a lot more details to give you a really clear approach. But what you always do is focus on the conduct and the performance, and it's not nearly as difficult to document as you might think. I'll give you an illustration. I had an employee. I had 2 female employees complain that another employee was staring at them. And, the question was, well, how can we prove that? And he said, I wasn't staring. Well, then it comes down to a case of credibility. And I believe, we believed that the 2 female employees were much more credible than the other person. We went ahead and proposed his removal for threatening the employee. And that, of course, what that did was bring the case to a head finally. And we were able to have a serious conversation. And he eventually took a temporary job somewhere else. But that's the whole point. We have to stop thinking we can't because this is fuzzy. Be as clear as you can in terms of what the problem is. Can you be as clear so that you can explain it to yourself? Once you're clear about what the issues are, then that dictates the action. And the action is, what's the behavior or the performance that's creating problems, and how do I go about bringing it to a head and ultimately dealing with it? Again, for any of these